Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of KRAD COVID Readings. I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido, doing my bit to make the pandemic palatable. Continuing the week of Cassie Zukov, I am reading another tale of Cassie Zukov, Weirdness Magnet, as my cat walks past. This one is called 7 Mile Race, and it's the story I actually wrote for my short story collection Without a License. When I was putting Without a License together in 2015, one of the difficult things was figuring out which of the many Dragon Precinct stories and which of the many Cassie Zukov stories to include. And then I decided to add value to the collection by writing stories in each of them specifically for this volume. So that even if you read the other stories in the book, you could still pick up this volume and get 2 new stories that you couldn't get anywhere else. So I wrote Partners in Crime, which was a Dragon Precinct story, which I've read previously on this channel. And then for Cassie, I did 7 Mile Race, which was inspired by a number of different things, including the infamous 7 Mile Bridge, which crosses between 2 of the keys. And you'll hear about that in here. It introduces 3 new characters to the Cassie's expansive supporting cast, all of whom derive from Norse mythology, as do several other of Cassie's supporting characters. And it also, there's one bit in there that was specifically, came out of a conversation actually that I had with my wife on the subject of Thor's hammer. So anyway, without further ado, here is 7 Mile Race, a tale of Cassie Zukov, Weirdness Magnet. I knew trouble was coming when I walked into Mayor Fred's saloon on a Saturday night, and Thor was in the bar. Having the Thunder God back in Key West was just the perfect capper to this shitty week. With the ramp up to the Daytona 500, it was the beginning of spring tourist season on the island. This was great for the Bottroff House Bed and Breakfast on Eaton Street, where I lived and worked, and the Sea Clips Dive Shop over on Stock Island, where I just worked. It wasn't so hot in terms of keeping me from getting homicidal. From December to February, the tourists were mostly casual, just folks coming down to get away from the cold farther north. But Daytona signaled the beginning of the silly season that also included Bike Week in early March, and the great horror that is spring break right after that. That was when all the crazies showed up. And nobody was crazier than Thor, one of several Norse deities in my life. About 6'10" with shoulders the size of Ohio, Thor had a red crew cut and a thick red beard that made him look like half the bears on the island, except for the fact that he wasn't gay. I hadn't seen him since New Year's, and I really hoped he wasn't going to hit on me again. Or hit on anyone else. Or hit anything else. Of course, he saw me as soon as I came in. The house band, 1812, was tuning up for their set, and Thor was sitting at the table by the big ficus tree that Mayor Fred's was built around. My usual table. To be fair, the Aesir had an affinity for the ficus. That was Key West's hanging tree in the 19th century, but the tourist websites won't tell you that it's also a root of Yggdrasil, the world tree that links the 9 worlds together. "Ah, fair and lovely Dis," he bellowed. "It is good to see you again." I closed my eyes and sighed. I supposed it was too much to ask that he'd finally pay attention and start calling me Cassie like I'd asked him a billion times. "Come join me and we will toast to our lost comrades." There was no way to gracefully refuse, though I was tempted to gracelessly do so. Last April, I discovered that A, the Norse gods were real, B, there weren't that many of them left, and C, I sorta kinda was one. A fate goddess, one of the Disir. Since then, I'd saved the world from Ragnarok and seen 2 of those gods die. A toast to their memory probably wouldn't be too terribly bad. As I sat in the chair next to him around the small round table, I shook my head. "I'm surprised to see you, Thor. As I recall, you swore after what happened at the Red Garter over New Year's that you'd never set foot on this island again." Thor waved an arm. "'Twas but a trifle. The owner was a varlet and a knave, and that lady was mine by right of conquest, and besides, I only broke one of those bouncers' arms." Adina came by before I could comment. "Your usual cast?" I nodded, and Thor downed the half-pint he'd had in front of him. "And another for me, sweet Adina." She chuckled. "You betcha." Thor watched her ass wiggle as she walked toward the bar. I just shook my head. Adina was a lesbian, which Thor already knew from the last 4 times he offered her the gift of his sexual favors. To be fair, he was incredibly drunk 3 of those times. "So, what brings you back?" I asked by way of taking his attention off of Adina's posterior. "Tomorrow is the Daytona 500, and I wish to observe the festivities in a convivial atmosphere." I nodded. Thor drove a muscle car, so of course he was into the race. Me, my car nut days were behind me, and these days Daytona was just another event that brought the crazy to the island. "Besides," Thor continued, "if my brother loses, I am in a fine place to celebrate. And should he win, this is the ideal locale to drown my sorrows." I shot Thor a look. He told me once that Tyr was one of the gods who still lived, and he was also Thor's brother. Tyr is in the race? He uses the name Jamie McIntyre for reasons known only to himself, but yes. My eyes widened. That pretentious asshole who always wears his driving gloves is really Tyr? Indeed, that is he, though he wears the gloves to cover the false hand that Eitri Broker fashioned for him. I recalled the story. After being told I was a Dece, I devoured everything I could on Norse myth, though the reality proved to only occasionally intersect with Snorri Sturluson. That was after Fenris bit off his hand, right? Thor nodded as Adina brought our beers by. He raised his pint. "To Odin, the All-Father! To Loki Laufeyson, my devious cousin!" I raised my pint as well. "Skål!" I'd been there when both Odin and Loki had died, and it had been, well, very weird both times. I really hoped that was the last time I'd have to deal with that. 1812, as usual, played a spectacular set of rock and roll cover tunes. It being Saturday night, the bar was packed, and the band stuck with well-known classics, including plenty of audience requests. It being Daytona weekend, there were a lot of calls for Lynyrd Skynyrd, the Allman Brothers, Government Mule, ZZ Top, Molly Hatchet, and so on. Chet Smith, the bass player, had been bitching all week about how they were going to have to play all that redneck shit. After the second set ended, Thor turned to me. "Beautiful Dece, will you do me the honor of your company here on the morrow to watch my brother compete and, if the Norns are kind, lose horribly?" I knew Ihor, the bartender, would be placing the big projector screen in front of the stage tomorrow and playing the race on it. Normally I would have refused on principle, as I hadn't watched a race in years, and the last time I agreed to do something with Thor it ended spectacularly badly, but knowing that Tyr would be one of the competitors, I was curious. The owners of C-Clips were race car nerds. The Daytona was considered a holiday and the dive shop was always closed on that day, so I didn't have my usual Sunday afternoon dive. "Sure, as long as you understand that we're staying right here in the bar. Under no circumstances am I accompanying you back to Summerland Key." Thor sighed and shrugged. "'Tis your loss, superlative Dece." "Do you keep a thesaurus around for new adjectives to use to describe me?" He grinned. "No, not at all. I simply find your beauty inspiring." I had to admit, he displayed a certain charm. But I also had a first-hand report from one of his conquests that he wasn't exactly a master of the bedroom, no matter what he claimed. I came to Mayor Fred's the next day, when Thor again waited at the table by the ficus. There was a big crowd of racing enthusiasts, plus a few tourists, and regulars like Larry, an immortal who'd been sitting at this particular bar since the day it opened. To Thor's great disappointment, Jamie McIntyre won. In his post-race interview, he spouted all the usual cliches, most of which I tuned out, but I did see the 2 members of his pit crew standing proudly behind him. They were both very short, with huge noses. "Also," he drawled with a southern accent that was way too exaggerated, "want to thank my boys in the old pit crew, the Ivaldi brothers. I couldn't have done none of this without these 2 fellas." Surprised, I turned to stare at Thor. The Ivaldi brothers? His pit crew is Eitri Broker, aren't they? "Of course," Thor said as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Thor drank a great deal after the race and tried to talk me into going home with him to his bungalow in Summerland Key, attempting to entice me by waggling his eyebrows and saying, again, that his hammer gets bigger if you rub it. I politely declined the first time and rudely declined the second time. I held a knee to the nuts in reserve for the third, but that sadly never came. I thought he'd found some other woman to set his sights on, right up until some tourist screamed that he found a body under the pool table. That body turned out to be Thor, very passed out. We left him there until closing, and then Ihor, Chet, and I all half-rolled, half-carried his sorry ass out to the sidewalk. Sure enough, his car was idling at the curb waiting for him. Thor had a 1964 Pontiac GTO, a make and model that was nicknamed a goat, fitting for a guy who used to fly around in a chariot pulled by goats. Somehow the car always knew when Thor was passed out drunk, which was fairly often, and just showed up for him and took him home. Once we poured him into the front seat, the car zoomed off down green. The next few days were incredibly busy, as the island was flooded with tourists in the aftermath of the race. Seaclips was booming, the bed and breakfast was full. I had to actually give up my room and sleep on the sofa in the lobby for 2 nights, and I didn't have the chance to get back to Mayor Fred's until Thursday afternoon. It was raining and windy, the water choppy enough that Seaclips canceled all dives. This being Florida, by the time I drove back to Key West from Stock Island and walked to Mayor Fred's, the rain had led up to a drizzle, though it was still windy enough that the water was probably still a pain to dive in, especially for casual divers who were the bulk of our clientele. 2 short men were holding court at the table by the ficus. They were surrounded by half a dozen people, mostly tourists I didn't recognize, but also Larry and 1 or 2 other regulars. Thor, I noticed, was nowhere to be seen. I recognized the pair instantly as the pit crew who had been standing behind Tyr at Daytona. Both of them had shaggy brown hair and noses the size of cantaloupes. The only way to tell them apart was that one had a beard and one didn't. "Well, well, well," I said as I walked up to them, "if it isn't the sons of Ivaldi." The 2 dwarves looked up and laughed heartily. The one with the beard said, "At last, it's Castor Zukov of the Disir." Larry shot me a look even as I winced. "Castor? Is that really?" "Yes, that's my full name. My parents named me and my twin brother Castor and Pollux because they're insane, and if anyone calls me Castor again, I can promise that their fate will be drastically changed." I stared at the dwarves and pointed a finger at them. "That goes double for you 2 garbanzos." Both of them held up their hands, and the clean-shaven one said, "We vowed to forget we ever knew your full name, Cassie." "That's better." "Please," the bearded one said, "have a seat. You obviously know who we are." But not which is which." The bearded one laughed, while the clean-shaven one said, "I'm Eitri, the good-looking one." "In your dreams, brother." Broker punched Eitri lightly on the arm to punctuate his point. Larry took off his raised ball cap and scratched his bald crown. "These 2 jokers have been telling tall tales." Eitri raised a bushy eyebrow. "Is that meant to be a comment about our height?" "Psh," I said as I folded my 5'11" frame into a chair and sat opposite the brothers. "You're all too short." "If it is tales from tall people we will hear this night," Broker said, grabbing his pint of beer, "then it should be from the oversized Dees here. Part of why we came to this island was to hear firsthand of your adventures." I used to be squirrely about talking about my being a fate goddess in front of the general public, but after what happened over Christmas, pretty much everyone in the Keys knew exactly what I was. The ones who didn't buy it just chalked it up as another crazy Key West story like all the others they didn't believe. So I told the story of how I stopped Loki from bringing about Ragnarok, and how I helped Odin and Loki and Sigyn stop the spirit of the Calusa tribe from committing mass murder at the cost of Odin's own life, and the story of how a mermaid got revenge on Loki for a long-ago crime by killing him, and a bunch more stories. But I was curious about these 2 and the guy they worked for. "So you manage Tyr's cars?" "Yes, we currently dabble in vehicular modification," Eitri said with a twinkle in his eye. "I assume you've seen Thor's GTO?" I nodded. "And ridden in it." "Our handiwork," Broker said proudly. That explained why the car had a mind of its own, anyhow. "You made his hammer, too, right?" "And Sigyn's snare drum. We understand the troupe she performs with will be here this even, yes?" "Yeah," I said. 1812's drummer went by Ginny Blake, but her real name was Sigyn, another of the Aesir and also Loki's wife, although I guess widow was the better word now. She had a glorious brass snare drum that she guarded with her life. Now I knew why. "Excellent," Broker said in reply to my positive reply. "We have heard her perform in the past, but not with these particular minstrels. Can we drag it back to Thor's hammer a minute? There's something about it that's always bugged me." Well, okay, there were a lot of things about Thor in general, and the hammer in particular that bugged me, but I wasn't about to get into that. "You guys made weapons for a lot of the Aesir, right?" "Of course," Broker said. Eitri grinned. "All of the good ones, certainly." "Nobody else that I know of among them used a hammer as a weapon. Neither did any of the Vikings. For everyone else, it's a tool. So why did you make him a hammer?" Broker rolled his eyes. "Because the big fool couldn't hang on to any of the others." "You see," Eitri said, leaning forward. We kept making swords and axes and maces for Thor, and in less than a month he would return to us with a tale of woe, that he'd lost it, or broken it, or misplaced it, or gave it to some woman he was wooing. We take great pride in our craft, Broker added, and take great care in the making. And we expect our clients to show similar care in their use. If they don't, then the care is, shall we say, reduced. Eitri grinned, which is why we simply took one of our work hammers that was lying about the forge, made it indestructible, and put enchantments on it. He can't give it away, nor can anyone else use it. I nodded. So he can't lose this one because it always flies back to his hand. The dwarves exchanged glances. Well, Broker said slowly, if he gets his hand up fast enough, then yes. For a couple of seconds, I stared at them. Then I burst out laughing. The Ivaldis joined in the laughter. Either way, Eitri said between guffaws, it was guaranteed to be the last weapon we'd ever have to make for him. Ginny came in then, snare drum in hand. The rest of the drum kit was already set up, and broke into a huge grin at the sight of my table. Eitri! Broker! I despaired of seeing you after so many days had passed. I'm afraid the usual post-race celebration was even heartier than usual, Eitri said with a rueful grin. Indeed, Tyr is still recovering, though he claimed he would attempt to join us to see your minstrels perform this even. Ginny chuckled. We're actually referred to as a band, and I'm much happier to see the two of you in any case. Likewise, my dear, Eitri said. We were especially concerned after the trickster's demise. Are you well? I wish people would stop asking me that, Ginny said a little too emphatically. Loki was a terrible person. He hasn't even been a true husband to me in far too long, and this isn't even the first time he's died on me. The rest of 1812 trickled in, and they started setting up. Larry started telling some stories of his own from his decades of sitting in this bar, and that went on until 1812's first set started. They rocked the joint, as usual. Toward the end of the set, Bobby Malewski, the lead guitarist, looked right at me and said, "This is for Cassie." And then they dove into REM's It's the End of the World as We Know It and I Feel Fine, which they've been dedicating to me on and off for months now, ever since I stopped Ragnarok in this very bar. I just rolled my eyes as the joke was starting to wear thin. On the other hand, it was a good set ender. Just as the band started to come down off the stage, a booming voice came from the entrance by the merch table, just as a different booming voice came from the other side of the bar, near the pool table. "Cassie!" one cried in a familiar bellow, while the other yelled, "Here I am, boys and girls!" in the fakest southern accent I'd ever heard. Turning, I saw Thor come in by the bar, while Jamie McIntyre walked in by the merch table. Tyr looked very out of place in his long-sleeved Daytona 500 shirt, khakis, and racing gloves. T-shirts and shorts were the usual dress on the island. It wasn't as if his fake hand would be a big deal. It wouldn't even be the only prosthetic in the bar, as the sound guy, Paolo, also lost his hand, but he insisted on standing out. Which, I suppose, fit his personality, both as a god and as an asshole race driver. Thor and Tyr noticed each other, and their faces fell. They both came to the ficus and stared each other down. Brother, I see you won. Again. Course I did. What all did you expect? Regardless of expectation, I was hoping for your ignominious defeat. Nah, I'll leave the ignominy to you. How dare you! As entertaining as this wasn't, I decided to interrupt. If you two take your pants down to compare sizes, I'm having Ihor toss both of you out right now. Tyr turned away from Thor and looked at me with a spectacularly insincere grin. Well, looky here, if it ain't the Dees her own self. Pleased to meet you, lovely lady. I prefer my actual name of Cassie, but whatever. Ginny came over at that point, looking nauseated. I was wondering which of you two would arrive first. Leave it to you two to turn up together. Ah, fair Sigyn, Thor said. It is good to see you well after your loss. It wasn't that much of a loss, she said, sitting down next to Eitri. I prefer not to speak of it. Yeah, Tyr said, pulling a chair from a nearby table. Show some respect to the lady, brother. If I do, brother, it will not be due to your desiring it. I rolled my eyes and excused myself to the bathroom. I didn't actually have to go, but there was a line, and I figured that standing on it would keep me away from the posturing for a bit. By the time I got back to the table, 1812 was setting back up for the second set. It had been a really long line. But the two brothers were still standing nose to nose. Least I didn't go and get Heimer killed on a simple little old fishing trip. And I had the brains not to place my hand in a wolf's mouth. Not the only time anyone would say you'd have brains, truth be tell. Thor opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. Will you two shut the fuck up already? I looked at the dwarves. They always like this? No, usually they're contentious. I snorted, then looked back at the two gods. Now either sit down and shut up and enjoy the music, or you can both go somewhere else. Be assholes at Sloppy Joe's or Irish Kevin's. I deliberately suggested my two least favorite bars on Duval Street. They both reluctantly sat down, arms folded. Rolling my eyes, I sat as well, the five of us crammed around a tiny table. 1812 led off the second set with Rockpile's Play That Fast Thing One More Time, which opened with a big complex drum bit. That, at least, got Thor and Tyr to stop being all pouty, and instead got them to stare at Ginny. By the end of the song, they both had expressions on their faces that were making me nostalgic for pouty. She is a magnificent maiden, is she not? Yeah, it's a mighty fine filly. I'd rolled my eyes enough at these two enough times that I half expected to see the back of my head. For fuck's sake, she isn't either of those things. She's a person. Who has suffered a great loss. Not that old Loki's all that much of a loss, really. She requires the gift of comfort and pleasure. Yup, and I'm just the fellow to give it to her. You! Do not make me laugh, Tyr. You could not bring pleasure to a concubine to whom you'd paid extra. Yeah, well, paying's the only way you're going to get an idiot tail. Eitri and Broker were just chortling to themselves. They were sure as shit enjoying this more than I was. Will you two shut up? All you do is bitch each other out. I mean, I get it, you're brothers, but I've got a twin brother, not to mention the brattiest little sister ever, and we're not this bad. I mean, hell, why don't you just have a race in those surrogate penises you call cars and have done with it? Both men turned with huge grins on their faces. Now that's a mighty fine notion there. Agreed! A wager it shall be, and I shall trounce this lout with his puny vehicle. Now Eitri spoke up. Hey, we put together that puny vehicle, same as we did yours. Thor put up a hand. Of course, good dwarves, your work is doubtless superb, but a steed is only as good as his rider. That last was with a scowl at his brother. I put my head in my hands. Fuck me sideways, I've created a monster. And the winner shall have the right to woo Sigyn, Thor said while pounding his fist on the table, making everyone's drinks shake and slosh onto the worn wood. Sounds pretty dang fine to me. I said slowly, don't you think Ginny should have some say in this? She shall have her say when the wooing commences, Thor said. Eitri grinned. So what track shall we use? Thor frowned. No track. That is where this varlet plies his trade. It shall be on a proper road. Kind of obvious, ain't it? Tyr said with a grin. Gotta be the 7 Mile Bridge. Indeed! Thor's face broke into a huge grin of its own. I put my head in my hands. The 7 Mile Bridge was the part of the overseas highway that linked the keys to each other. Enabling you to drive from Miami all the way down to Key West. The bridge itself linked the 7 Mile gap between Marathon Key and Little Duck Key. You doofuses do realize there'll be other people driving on it, right? Tyr chuckled. Nah, little lady. I am talking about the current bridge. My eyes widened. Are you kidding me? The Overseas Highway was originally the Overseas Railway. After a hurricane trashed it in the 1930s, the railroad sold the right-of-way to the state. Most of that old railway was now the highway, with one exception. They built a new 7 Mile Bridge in the 1970s, but the old one was still there. Mostly. You do know there's a big-ass gap in the old bridge, right? And it hasn't exactly been maintained as a roadway. Hell, they even banned bikes on the bridge because of the structural issues, and the bit between the gap and Little Duck is mostly just old train tracks barely held together by rust. Hence the challenge, Thor bellowed. It shall be glorious. We race tonight after the tavern closes. Which was how I wound up standing next to my truck on Little Duck Key at 4:30 in the morning. Thor and Tyr were 7 miles away on Marathon, but Eitri had given me a set of what he called special binoculars, which enabled me to see the other end of the bridge clearly. Larry, Bobby, and Jaina were all standing next to me with binoculars of their own. We were all curious as to how this absurd race would go. As we were driving across the current 7 Mile Bridge toward this idiotic race's finish line, Bobby had been staring over at the darkened original bridge. What do you think the over-under is on how soon they crash into the water and drown? Jaina had snorted. We ain't got that kind of luck. I don't know, ladies, Larry had said. The pair of them were a few sheets to the wind. Now I was peering through the dwarves' binoculars. Eitri was helping Thor into his goat, while Tyr was clambering into a heavily modified stock car, covered in corporate logos with brokers' help. You didn't usually see a stock car on a regular road, but given that the Ivaldi brothers built this, it probably wasn't your average stock car anyhow. The frame looked vaguely like a Ford, but it didn't actually match any specific car I knew of. Thor just sat in the car staring straight ahead while Tyr was having trouble keeping his grip on the steering wheel. I shook my head. Larry, those two aren't just a few sheets to the wind, more like the whole bedroom set. I looked at Bobby. I'll take the under, 2 minutes in. Bobby chuckled, but I was genuinely worried that the two jackasses were going to drown themselves. Peering back through the binoculars, I saw that Eitri and Broker were standing between the cars with their hands up. Both cars were revving, but it was too far away for me to hear how the engines sounded. Of course, they were probably both purring. I'd never heard a hiccup from Thor's goat, and Tyr's stock car just won the biggest race in NASCAR. The dwarves lowered their arms, and the cars took off. It was pretty hard to follow them from this far away, but as they got closer, it got easier. The stock car and the goat went neck and neck, neither one taking the lead for more than a second or two before the other one overtook. I took a look at the drivers. Tyr was grinning and looking like he was enjoying himself, while Thor was grinding his teeth and looking all determined. I could see sparks fly as the cars rubbed against the guardrail, which was made from the old railroad tracks. Peering through her own binoculars, Bobby said, "Neither one of those idiots is wearing a helmet." "Of course they aren't," I muttered. "I don't think their heads could get any more damaged anyhow," Jaina said with a snort. I couldn't argue that particular point. They were getting to the moment of truth, the gap near Pigeon Key, which was originally a swing span to allow boats traffic across, but which was removed after the new bridge was built. They had to be getting close to 200 miles an hour, and I just hoped it was enough to clear the gap. Mostly because if it wasn't, I sure as shit wasn't diving after them. When I was a kid, I never used to understand why they would show big moments on TV shows and in movies in slow motion. It wasn't like time really slowed down, so why do that? Just let it play out in real time. But it can be damn subjective, and as soon as the two cars hit the end of the road and flew into the air over the Moser Channel, time did seem to slow down. It was like I was watching a Dukes of Hazzard rerun with the General Lee flying through the air in slow-mo, except it was two cars and the drivers were even bigger dumbasses than the Duke boys. They flew in a big arc through the air. We weren't close enough to hear anything, but I could tell looking that both gods were shouting at the top of their lungs. Tyr landed first, the stock car bouncing on the rusty railroad tracks that covered in wild overgrowth. Thor landed second, but only the front wheels on the road, the back half of the goat dangling off the edge. I winced. The 64 GTO had rear-wheel drive. I waited for Thor and his car to tumble into the ocean, which was only going to be a shame insofar as it was a really nice car. But then the front wheels spun madly, and the car took off onto the tracks. Son of a bitch. Tyr was driving more cautiously on this stretch, as it was far more treacherous than the glorified bike path of the previous leg of the race. This had no paving, no solid surface, and an infrastructure that looked like it would fall into the water at any second. In fact, I could see bits of the bridge flying off it. Thor, though, was flooring it. The goat caught up to the stock car in short order, and by the time I didn't need the binoculars anymore because they were in plain sight, Thor had a length and a half on his brother. Tyr put on a burst of speed at the end, but there was no doubt at the finish line. Thor was the winner. The goat screeched to a halt on the dirt and grass, tires spinning, dirt flying, the car doing a full 180. Thor leapt out of the car before it finished spinning, crying, "Ha ha! Again the Thunderer is victorious!" The stock car decelerated less spectacularly. Tyr got out looking all kinds of pouty. "Nicely done there, brother, though I bet your undercarriage is all messed up." "Of what concern is that? I have won! The details are of no consequence. Thor has beaten his brother. Let those varlets claim that Tyr is stronger and smarter and faster and braver. They are all fools!" I turned to Bobby, and here I was worried he was going to gloat. Thor walked up to Jaina and wrapped one massive arm around her. "Ah, Jaina, my sweet, lovely minstrel! Come away with me and let us once again celebrate as only a god can." Somehow, Jaina managed to extricate herself. She'd already gone to bed with Thor once, and that experience was disappointing enough to convince her never to bother again. "Sorry, Chuckles. Got an early morning tomorrow." Luckily, Thor wasn't bright enough to figure out that, if that was true, she wouldn't have stayed up this late to watch the race. "Barbara Ann!" Thor cried to Bobby, undeterred. Since Bobby was asexual, this was a lost cause. "My answer hasn't changed since the last 40 times, Thor." "Magnificent Dees!" I just glared at him. "Pity. And the taverns are all closed, thus depriving me of further options for celebrations. But on the morrow, the drinks in Mayor Fred's saloon shall all be raised in honor of Thor. Thor the Thunderer. Thor, Odin's son. Thor the loudmouth. Thor the braying jackass, I added. Laughing, he replied, Oh, no, superlative Dees. Your shrewishness shall not spoil my victory. You don't mind if my shrewishness keeps trying, do you? Tyr walked up to Thor and put a hand out. Good race there, bro. Looks like you won fair and square. I accept your craven acknowledgement of my superiority, brother, and will allow you to buy the first round tomorrow night. The next night could charitably be called insane. Friday nights were crazy at the best of times, and we had the post-Daytona crowd and the pre-Bike Week crowd in addition to the usual tourists. When I got to Mayor Fred's after my evening dive, Thor was, of course, the center of attention, and he made sure there was no danger of that changing anytime soon. 1812 was between sets, and he was standing at the front of the bar, braying and laughing and hitting on every woman in the room. I saw Eitri amidst the crowd of cheering patrons, and Broker was probably in there somewhere too. Larry was in his usual spot at the bar, laughing along with everyone else. Tyr sat at the back corner of the bar near the pool table. Not really wanting a piece of Thor's insanity, I sought out the loser, who was nursing a bourbon. Without preamble, I sat next to him and said, So, I thought the whole point of the exercise was to get to ask Ginny out. Yet there he is, hitting on every other woman in the bar. You missed it before, little lady. Thor went a-courting as soon as Sigyn showed her pretty face, and she turned him down faster than snot. And I bet plenty of snot was involved. Tyr laughed. Yeah, probably. It's all right. The big fella done earned it. No, I didn't. I signaled Ihor and ordered a beer. Once he went off to pour my pint, Tyr said, Now look, little lady, I know you ain't all that fond of my brother, but he did win the race. Oh, I'm not saying he didn't earn it because I don't like him. I'm saying he didn't earn it because you let him win. Tyr shot me a look. Excuse me? Oh, don't give me that innocent look. You suck at it worse than you suck at that southern accent. Besides, I'm a fate goddess. Remember, I can see shit most people can't see. On the last leg, you went all cautious on the tracks. Them tracks was dangerous. Could have ripped the heck out of my undercarriage, like I said afterward. What's wrong with my accent? Please. I've seen what Eitri and Broker did for Thor's goat. Ihor handed me my pint, and I gulped down a bit. For starters, they gave it front-wheel drive. Probably precisely to avoid what would have happened last night if he only had rear wheel. Plus, the car's smart. Hell, it's probably smarter than he is. I chuckled. Well, okay, my beer is probably smarter than he is. And that's just a car they threw together for somebody they don't even like. You expect me to believe that your pit crew wouldn't magic up your stock car as much as they could? Your undercarriage would have been fine, and if it wasn't, they'd have fixed it up in time for Avondale. Yeah, we gotta hit the road for Arizona tomorrow. He shook his head. Look, times have changed. Don't nobody worship us no more. Hell, if it wasn't for the comic books and the movies, we'd probably have no power left at all. But those of us who did survive, we got stuff to keep us going. I got my racing, Eitri and Broker got their tinkering and building, Sigyn's got her band. I hear tell Odin took up scuba diving. I nodded. The Allfather had actually been an excellent diver. Tyr took a sip of his bourbon. As for Loki, he was always scheming, but Thor? He shook his head. He ain't got much going. He's just Thor, you know? 1,000 years ago, he was stumbling around, drinking, being an idiot, and sleeping with any girl that'd have him, and here it is 1,000 years later, and he's still drinking, still stumbling around being an idiot, and still sleeping with any girl that'd have him. We all found us a life. He didn't. He let out a long breath. He's my brother. Hell, I'm his big brother. I've been around a lot longer than he has, and I've seen stuff that'd turn his beard white. Especially with the Allfather not around no more, I gotta look out for him. So, yeah, I let him win the race. I figured he deserved to have something. He frowned at me. You ain't gonna tell him, are you, little lady? That depends. Can you, for fuck's sake, not call me little lady? Seriously, what is it with you guys and your stupid nicknames? My name is Cassie. It's just 2 syllables. Tyr threw his head back and laughed. I noticed a complete lack of drawl in the laugh. Then he held up his glass. You got yourself a deal, Cassie. To Thor's victory. I held up my pint. To being a good brother. We clinked our glasses and each took a sip. A crashing sound came from the front of the bar. I looked over to see that Thor had fallen over and a crowd was gathered around him. With a sideways glance at Tyr, I asked, I don't suppose you can take him with you to Arizona? I ain't that good a brother. Too bad. I got up and headed to the front of the bar, pushing my way through the tourists who were gawking at the drunken lout who'd gone from life of the party to rug. Okay, folks, nothing to see here. Come on, Thor. Upsy daisy. Thor didn't budge. The bar was too crowded to try to carry him out, so we just left him there. For the rest of the night, people danced around him, drank around him, tripped over him, and generally had a great time while he snored on the floor of Mayor Fred's saloon. It was a fantastic party in his honor. Probably the best party he never saw. Well, okay, except for that one time, but that's another story. 7 Mile Race is available in Without a License, The Fantastic Worlds of Keith R.A. DeCandido, which is on sale now from eSpec Books. It is also going to be in my next Cassie Zukov collection, which will be called Ragnarok in a Hard Place, which will be published by Plus One Press as soon as I have finished writing all the stories in it. The title story still has to be written. And I may be writing another story for it. I haven't decided yet. But that will happen eventually. Please follow me online. My website is DeCandido.net. My blog is DeCandido.wordpress.com. And you can support me at Patreon.com/KRAD. And your support really does help pay the bills. You get TV reviews, movie reviews, cat pictures, excerpts from my works in progress, first looks at my first drafts, and vignettes featuring my original characters. I've done more than half a dozen Cassie stories alone. Little vignettes featuring Cassie and her various supporting characters. So check that out. And on Friday, we'll be back with the last of our Cassie Zukov week, which is a story called Behind the Wheel, which also features Tyr and Thor. Thanks very much, and please stay safe.